Close your eyes for a moment and think about Britain in the 1960s. The streets were narrower, the skies were greyer, and the roads were alive with a very particular kind of energy. You'd hear the rumble of small engines echoing down terraced streets. You'd see cars parked bumper to bumper outside corner shops, outside factories, outside schools. These weren't just vehicles, they were part of the landscape. They were as British as a cup of tea on a rainy Tuesday morning. Every neighborhood had its own fleet of familiar shapes, and if you grew up in that era, you'll remember exactly what those shapes looked like. Today, we're counting down 10 British cars that made the 1960s iconic, cars that shaped the look, the feel, and the identity of an entire decade. And the car at number 1 didn't just stand out, it defined the entire decade. Number 10, Hillman Imp. In the 1960s, this was a car you simply couldn't ignore if you lived in a working-class neighborhood. The Hillman Imp arrived in 1963 as a direct answer to the question Britain was asking: how do ordinary families get from A to B without spending a fortune? Built up in Linwood, Scotland, the Imp was small, light, and just clever enough to feel modern. You'd spot it parked outside council houses, sitting in factory car parks, or making its way up narrow Scottish roads. It was the car of young couples, of first-time drivers, of people who needed something reliable and affordable. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. It did its job without complaint, day after day. The Hillman Imp wasn't trying to impress anyone, and somehow, that's exactly why people loved it. This wasn't just a car, it was the sound of ordinary Britain getting on with life. But the next car on our list carried a little more elegance with it wherever it went. Number 9, Triumph Herald. There was something almost cheerful about the Triumph Herald. With its sharp, separate wings and its surprisingly wide turning circle, it looked like it was designed to navigate the tight lanes and cramped high streets of 1960s Britain, and honestly, it was. Launched in 1959 and built well into the 60s, the Herald became a favorite among suburban families and young professionals who wanted something a step above the ordinary. You'd see it parked outside semi-detached houses in places like Coventry, Birmingham, and Bristol. It came in estate, saloon, and convertible versions, which meant it suited everyone from the family man to the weekend driver. The convertible version, in particular, felt genuinely joyful, the kind of car you'd drive with the roof down on a bright June afternoon through the English countryside. The Triumph Herald wasn't just transport. It was a small piece of optimism in a changing Britain. And speaking of optimism, the next car wore it right on its bodywork. Number 8, Vauxhall Victor. The Vauxhall Victor was Britain looking across the Atlantic and bringing a little bit of that American style home. With its wide chrome grille, its slightly curved roofline, and its bold colors, the Victor looked like it had more ambition than most British roads could handle. Through the early and mid-1960s, it became a staple of the British suburban driveway. Middle-income families chose it because it felt spacious, modern, and just a little bit aspirational. You'd see it parked outside new-build estates on the edges of towns, or pulling into the car parks of newly opened supermarkets. Salesmen drove it. Managers drove it. It was the car that said you were doing well without needing to shout about it. For thousands of British families, the Vauxhall Victor was the clearest symbol that things were improving, that life in the 60s had a little more room in it than it used to. This wasn't just a car, it was a postcard from a Britain on the rise. But the next entry didn't just sit on the driveway, it became part of everyday British life at every level. Number 7, Ford Cortina. If there was one car that was simply everywhere in 1960s Britain, the Ford Cortina had a very strong claim to that title. Launched in 1962, the Cortina was practical, affordable, well-built, and perfectly sized for the British road. It wasn't trying to be exotic. It was trying to be useful, and it succeeded spectacularly. You'd see it on every type of road, outside factories at shift change, lined up outside railway stations, sitting in the driveways of terraced houses from Manchester to Southampton. Taxi drivers used it. Company representatives drove it across the length of the country. Young families chose it because it was big enough for a pram in the boot and small enough for city parking. The Ford Cortina was the car that kept Britain moving during one of its most transformative decades. It was dependable in the way a good neighbor is dependable. Always there, always steady, never letting you down. This wasn't just a car, it was the workhorse of a nation. But the next car traded reliability for something far more exciting, pure, open road thrill. Number 6. Austin-Healey 3000. Not every car in 1960s Britain was built for the school run. Some were built to make your heart beat a little faster. The Austin-Healey 3000 was one of those cars. Long bonneted, low slung, and finished in shades of red and British racing green, it was a sports car that looked exactly like a sports car should. You wouldn't see it everywhere, it was never a common sight on the high street. But when you did see one, you stopped and looked. It belonged to the more successful end of the 60s, the businessman who'd done well, the racing enthusiast who took his car to weekend events at Silverstone or Goodwood. It represented a Britain that was beginning to enjoy itself again after years of post-war austerity. The Austin-Healey 3000 didn't carry children or shopping. It carried possibility. And in the 1960s, possibility felt very British indeed. But the next car brought sporting thrills to a much wider audience. Number 5. Triumph Spitfire. The Triumph Spitfire did something remarkable. It made sports car ownership accessible. Before it arrived in 1962, open-top driving was largely reserved for those with deeper pockets. The Spitfire changed that conversation. It was small, it was sharp, and it looked genuinely exciting sitting at the curb. Young men saved up for one. Young couples bought one together. It was the car of Saturday afternoons, of drives along coastal roads, of feeling, just for a moment, that life was exactly as good as it should be. You'd see Spitfires parked outside grammar schools, outside newly opened coffee bars, outside the kinds of flats that young professionals were renting in the 60s as cities began to feel alive again. The Spitfire wasn't just a car, it was a declaration. It said, "I'm young, I'm hopeful, and I intend to enjoy myself." This wasn't just a car, it was the spirit of a generation finding its feet. But the next car on our list belonged to a very different kind of driver entirely. Number 4. Rover P5. While younger Britain was out in its Spitfires and Heralds, the establishment was quietly travelling in the Rover P5. Long, formal, and built with a seriousness that bordered on authority, the P5 became the car of choice for British institutions. Government ministers used it. Senior civil servants were driven to work in it. It sat outside Whitehall offices and country manor houses with equal composure. The P5 didn't rush. It moved through the landscape with a deliberate, measured calm that perfectly reflected the world its owners inhabited. Its interior was wood and leather and silence, a traveling boardroom for the men who ran things. In a decade of enormous social change, the Rover P5 was a reminder that some parts of Britain were still operating exactly as they always had. Solid, formal, and quietly powerful. This wasn't just a car, it was the sound of authority on the move. But our next entry needed no authority, it earned its place through pure, undeniable beauty. Number 3. Jaguar EType. When the Jaguar EType was unveiled in 1961, it stopped people in their tracks. Literally. Crowds gathered wherever it appeared. Journalists ran out of words. It was long where other cars were short, curved where others were boxy, and fast in a way that felt almost unreasonable for a British road in the early 60s. The EType wasn't just a car, it was an event. You'd see it photographed on the cover of every motoring publication in the country. You'd see it parked outside restaurants in London's West End, drawing small crowds of admirers who'd simply stop to look. Successful businessmen bought it. Architects bought it. Anyone who wanted to make a statement about who they were bought it. The EType told the world that Britain could still produce something world-class, something that matched or surpassed anything coming out of Italy or Germany. In a decade when Britain was redefining itself, the EType was its most beautiful argument. This wasn't just a car, it was Britain at its most confident. But nothing defined the visual identity of 1960s Britain more completely than what comes next. Number 2. Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow. At the very top of the British automotive world in the 1960s sat the Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow, a car so composed, so quietly magnificent, that it barely needed to announce itself. Launched in 1965, the Silver Shadow was the transport of the truly successful. It glided past London's finest addresses, past the gates of country estates, past the doors of the most exclusive hotels. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The Silver Shadow represented the absolute pinnacle of what Britain could build, the finest materials, the most careful craftsmanship, the most refined engineering. Foreign dignitaries were driven in them. Royalty was seen in them. For anyone standing on a London pavement watching one pass, it was a reminder that Britain still made things of extraordinary quality and pride. The Silver Shadow wasn't a car for everyone, but it was a car everyone recognized. This wasn't just a car, it was Britain's finest hour on four wheels. And yet, for all its grandeur, nothing captured the heart of 1960s Britain the way our number one did. Number 1, the BMC Mini. This is the one. This is the car that didn't just belong to the 1960s, it became the 1960s. The Mini arrived in 1959, but it was through the 60s that it truly took over. And took over is not an exaggeration. By the middle of the decade, Minis were everywhere. Outside terraced houses in Liverpool, parked along the King's Road in London, sitting in factory car parks in Birmingham, tucked into tiny spaces on cobbled streets in Edinburgh. It was driven by nurses, by secretaries, by students, by racing drivers, by rock musicians, by factory workers, by housewives, by everyone. No other car in British history had ever managed to be so completely classless. A teenager saving up their first wages could own one. A celebrity could own one. And they both felt exactly the same pride in it. The Mini was compact in a way that suited Britain's narrow roads and tight car parks perfectly. It was economical in a way that suited ordinary British budgets perfectly. And it was designed, by Alec Isigonis, with a brilliance that turned every constraint into a clever solution. Its front-wheel drive, its transverse engine, its tiny footprint, all of it was revolutionary. But none of that technical brilliance is what made it number one on this list. What made the Mini number one is the way it looked on a British street. That little square shape. Those tiny wheels pushed right to the corners. That cheerful, slightly cheeky face at the front. It became part of the visual language of Britain the way red phone boxes and black taxi cabs did. When you think of 1960s Britain, truly picture it in your mind, the Mini is almost certainly somewhere in that image. This wasn't just a car. This wasn't even just an icon. The Mini was the 1960s itself, distilled into something you could park on any street in the country and it would look exactly right, exactly at home, exactly perfect for its time. And there you have it, 10 British cars that shaped the look and feel of an entire decade. From the humble Hillman Imp on working-class streets to the magnificent EType turning heads outside London restaurants, every one of these cars left a mark on the identity of Britain that still hasn't faded. Times have changed, of course. The streets are different now. The cars are quieter, smoother, more complicated. But somewhere in the back of your memory, those shapes are still there, parked outside the house you grew up in, or idling at traffic lights on a grey British morning. These cars weren't just transport. They were the decade. Which one do you remember most? Drop your answer in the comments below. We'd love to know your story. Until next time.